Welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Cielle Heiser, a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together with astrology. I'm Alicia Cielle Heiser, an astrologer, herbalist, and witch living in Oregon on Kalapuya land, and I offer astrology consultations and teachings aimed at helping you honor your most authentic self and trust your intuition.
I'm Lori Kaufman, an astrologer, tarot reader, writer, and teacher. I co-lead the Asteroid Special Interest Research Group for NCGR, an astrology organization, and I offer all different sorts of readings, online and in person.
Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about what your Saturn return means because it feels like such a buzzword that's always coming up on social media and people who are interested in astrology but might not necessarily be astrologers. Everyone always knows about the Saturn return, but they're not quite sure what exactly is their Saturn return or what to expect from that. And so, especially with Saturn kind of in the process of wrapping up its time in Pisces and starting off in Aries, and some of us are ending our Saturn returns, some of us are beginning our Saturn returns, it just feels like a really good time to release this episode. Um, and so, yeah, essentially, Lori, do you want to explain Saturn cycle a bit, Miss Saturn in
Yeah.
Aquarius? And yeah, just
Yes. When I actually first started learning or doing astrology, Saturn was such a pull for me. It was like the thing that was drawing me almost the most. And then I realized having an Aquarius stellium, I'm very Saturnian, and having such a strong Saturn in my chart, it made a lot of sense to why I felt so drawn to helping people with these themes. And so I took all kinds of courses and classes and read all the books and went down real deep dives with Saturn cycles, and that's what I specialized in for a long time. And I have just found that basically you can do this with every area of your life, but as you watch Saturn move through the areas of your life, especially if you're a person who has heavy Saturn influence, you're just gonna notice certain things feeling restrictive and then showing up differently. Whether it's good or bad is kind of up to your own free will or your own choices you make along the way. So when you're born, Saturn is in a place, right? So for me, Saturn is in Aquarius. It's mid to late Aquarius. For you, it's Pisces. For wherever it is in your chart, that is where it is on your birthday, right? So then as it moves through the zodiac, we have really important Saturn influence and then really less important. And I like to break it down in years of 7. So you have when you're born, then you have when you're 7 years old-ish, give or take a year or two, especially because Saturn spends about 2.5 to 3 years in every sign. So that entire time, so for me, because I have a fixed Saturn in Aquarius, when it was in Taurus, when I was 7, that would have been my first Saturn square. And you can look at that to see, okay, well, what happened during that first Saturn square? Then it'll move to the Saturn opposition when you're around 13, 14, 15-ish, give or take. And during that opposition, it's going to be a time of huge transformative, learning big lessons or having big changes show up in your life. Then around the age of 21, 20, 21, 22-ish, you're going to have the Saturn square again. And this is like the closing square. And I like to see that square as almost like a little bit of spice. It's like a little bit of hint of what your Saturn return might show up as, because you're old enough now to start seeing certain patterns show up or repeat. And then your Saturn return often marks the time where you get to transform those energies or become those energies and then shift into this new version of yourself. And then it continues. But I also find that there's just so many really interesting ways of looking at these Saturn, any Saturn placement through anywhere in the zodiac. When Saturn is in a blind spot to your Saturn, you might have a difficult time making decisions or setting boundaries. There might be moments of like unclear energy. I noticed that especially while it was in Pisces. I felt like my Saturn return was like the one time in my life where I felt so clear and so on top of things, and I got so much work done. I started my business and everything was honestly very great. I like have almost no complaints from my entire Saturn return. But I also have a very happy Saturn in a day chart. But the second it moved into Pisces, I just felt like my life was soup and I couldn't keep the pieces together all of a sudden. And all the things I started, it was like losing momentum. And I was noticing themes re-showing up in my life from the past, and just like very interesting going forward, especially after your first Saturn return. Everything is just a repeat. And so you're going to notice these things showing up for you and then re-showing up later on in your life. And then when you turn 35, 36, 37, maybe 38, depends on who you are, how it is in the chart. Um, that's going to be that first Saturn square again, repeating. So anything that happened to you when you were 7 years old is all of a sudden going to start coming up. And I've seen a lot of examples of like somebody having a big trauma show up. And then that trauma repeats itself in some way. I had a client recently who was telling me that their parents got divorced when they were 7, and she was 37 in the middle of a divorce. And so we were talking about how like that exact Saturn square for her has shown up as the exact Saturn square of her parents getting divorced for a lot of the same reasons. Um, and so things like that, I was like, this is the most literal and perfect example I've ever seen of this. But there are so many others like that where sometimes you have to squint a little bit, but it's just these like giant themes showing up for you and then like re-showing up later to get worked on or worked through. And how things get handled is very dependent on your chart. If you have a night chart, Saturn is going to be much harder on you. If you don't have a whole lot of Saturn influence, this is going to be something that maybe you're not used to.
Hmm.
As a very Saturnian person, I was already kind of used to having Saturn energy. So for me, it didn't feel that hard when I needed to buckle down. But for some people, they don't know how to buckle down. And so it knocks them off their feet and they get swept away. So it's always going to be a very nuanced relationship with these Saturn cycles.
Yeah.
And then just to quickly finish up my thought, you have your second return around 58, give or take a few years. So, you can do this with every age. 42 is going to be that opposition. Um, every time Saturn is, for me, in a fixed sign, for Alicia, in a mutable sign, whatever sign it's in, whenever it's in one of those squaring or opposing or conjunct signs, you're going to feel Saturn's push and pull and restructuring and movement, and you're going to have that heavy influence come back up.
Yeah, absolutely. And in particular, your Saturn return, everyone experiences it in their
Mhm.
late 20s and then their mid to late 50s and then again in their 80s if they live that long.
Mhm.
And whenever Saturn is in the same sign that it was in when you were born, you are generally within your Saturn return. And then identifying what degree your Saturn is at in your birth chart and finding the dates for when Saturn will return to that same degree. Most
Right.
of us will have 3 hits from Saturn for each, like Saturn square return up any of the Saturn transits,
Yeah.
because Saturn tends to move over the degree and then retrograde back and then move over the degree again. But some people get really lucky and Saturn does not actually retrograde over the degree of their Saturn. And so they
Mhm.
may only have one hit. But that, when Saturn returns to the exact same degree as it was when you were born, that is your exact Saturn return. And that tends to be when your Saturn return experience is the loudest and most potent.
Mhm.
Although that's not always true. For me in particular, I have something very big and personal happening in my life as Saturn returns into Pisces this fall. And Saturn's done hitting my personal planets in the mutable signs, but that last little dip of Saturn in Pisces this fall is actually going to be the biggest of all of the hits. So that's why it is important to be paying attention whenever Saturn is in the sign of your natal Saturn. You are still in your Saturn return, but identifying the dates of when it's exactly conjunct your natal Saturn can very often, like for me, that's when I tore my ACL when Saturn was conjunct my moon in the sixth house. And then a month or two later, when I got my actual Saturn return, was when I had the knee surgery. So that was quite literal. Um, but that can be helpful to pay attention to. And just to share those dates for 90s babies, I'm sorry for the folks born in the 1960s. I don't have Saturn and Aries and Pisces dates for you. But if you were born between May 21st of 1993 and June 30th of 1993, or January 28th of 1994 to April 7th of 1996, then your Saturn is in Pisces and you are wrapping up your Saturn return in Pisces because Saturn re-entered Pisces on March 7th of 2023 and then it entered Aries on May 25th of 2025 and then Saturn will return to Pisces for one last dip
Mhm.
on September 1st of 2025, and then it will enter Aries right around Valentine's Day of 2026 for good. And so then to just share the Saturn return dates for the Aries 90s babies, if you were born, Saturn was in Aries in the 90s between April 7th of 1996 to June 9th of 1998. And then it was also in Aries between October 25th of 1998 to March 1st of 99. And so you are now just starting your Saturn return in Aries as Saturn entered Aries on May 25th of this year, and then will be there until September 1st. And then it will enter Aries again on Valentine's Day of 2026 and stay there until April 13th of 2028. So those are dates, those are when your Saturn returns are, and then finding the exact date within that. Also, if you have any other personal points or planets in the cardinal signs, then Saturn and Aries will be either conjoining, squaring, or opposing those points and planets, which is not a Saturn return, but it's still a Saturn transit and can be quite loud and potent. And then same thing for the mutable signs as Saturn finishes up in Pisces. And Saturn is a planet of constriction. It's like a very, very difficult teacher, like a very strict teacher who makes you do your homework and makes you show up on time and is very, very like diligent and hard on you. But then at the end, you're like, wow, I'm actually really good at geometry, even though this
Right.
teacher was a complete asshole to me.
Yeah.
And so, Saturn wants to teach us lessons and Saturn can bring
Yeah.
us great rewards, especially if you have a more dignified Saturn.
Mhm.
But it's not comfortable. Like working with Saturn does not feel good. It should not feel
Yeah.
good. And actually, when you're in a time of a Saturn transit, intentionally bringing more austerity, more quiet meditation, more like stillness and slowness and patience in your life can be a very intentional way to cultivate Saturnian virtues and help you through the process because Saturn returns tend to bring a lot of consequences for poor decisions we've made. They tend to require a lot of effort and diligence and continuing to show up day after day after day and be very determined to make something happen. And like Lori said, Saturn transits will go differently for all of us depending on what our natal promise is. But to get the most out of your Saturn transit, taking things very seriously, being very, very mature, and thinking of the long term results and consequences of the decisions you make is how you're going to kind of get through the Saturn transit. And so especially for all of us for our first Saturn return in our 20s, that's kind of when you're like growing up and becoming an adult. And there's so much that becomes possible and potential for you after you complete your first Saturn return and you really step into your full maturity but it's like, polishing a diamond, like diamonds are formed under pressure, right? It's usually not a comfortable process, but it's a time Saturn has to do with age and maturity. Typically, Saturn transits tend to get easier as we get older. That's not always true. But as we get older and more mature, it's like fine wine. It ages well. And so as you learn those lessons that maturity requires, that can really help you when you're working with a difficult Saturn time.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I like to think of Saturn too, like with Chronos. And this is a rabbit hole I went down really deeply when I was studying like the ancient history of tarot. But Kronos was always shown with crutches and limping. He was
Hmm.
seen as the lame god. He always had like gashes in his legs. He was very like he was always just falling apart and he was old. But there was this wisdom that you gain from
Hmm.
what you've put your body through or from what you've experienced. And so there's this like kind of metaphor of like yeah, you've gotten so old that you need crutches and you're struggling and you're having X, Y, and Z problems, but you're also learning from those experience. And if you weren't limping, if you didn't go through that experience, you would have never learned from it, right?
Hmm.
Or you would have continued to do the thing that would have, I don't know, eventually caused it anyway, right? So, um, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about time, chronic,
Yeah.
Chronos.
Yeah. Saturn literally has to do with time. And
Yeah.
especially, Lori and I are both American, and in American culture, we do
Mhm.
not value our elders and we do not respect people as they age, and we do not create containers to really celebrate and learn from the wisdom that elders have to
Yeah.
share with us. And I think that is a huge deficit in
Yeah.
our culture, right? And that can also make working with Saturn harder because we don't value the wisdom that comes with age. We don't value maturity. We don't value, the power that comes from being in more limiting, constricting experiences. But really, coming into how like honorable it can be to have lived a long life and have a lot of wisdom from that, and to have experienced difficulty and adversity and hardship regardless of how old you are, and have a lot of wisdom from that. People who tend to have strong Saturns in their chart or really Saturnian energy tend to be very mature from a young age, and a lot of
Yes.
times that can be out of necessity and out of difficulty and not necessarily what they want their life to be like, but there is a
Yeah.
lot of power that can come from having that maturity and wisdom as well. Hey everyone, it's Alicia, and I offer 60 and 90-minute virtual astrology consultations where we explore your birth chart using Hellenistic techniques, myth, and herbal wisdom to help you understand the cycles weaving through your life so you can honor your most authentic self and trust your intuition. I'm offering 20% off my readings for listeners of the podcast when you use the code CONVO20 at checkout. The link to my booking page is in the show notes below.
Yeah, having to grow up very fast. That's a big thing I see with Aquarius and Capricorn people in general.
Hmm.
Going
And
through
Moon
a
Saturn
lot.
as well.
Yeah, yeah. Or Sun Saturn, really just having a
Yeah,
heavy
luminaries,
Saturn,
Saturns. Yeah.
yeah, luminary Saturns for sure. Um, And yeah, like we were kind of talking about this a couple weeks ago, but like it can be almost everybody in my life, like that I'm really close to, has a really strong either sun or moon Saturn.
Hmm.
And so sometimes I like struggle with people who don't because I'm like, how are you not Saturn? Like,
You have no container.
what do
Like,
you
grow
mean you're
up.
just having fun? Yeah, exactly. Grow up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is very funny to watch those like different aspects of Saturn um show up and manifest in those different ways.
Yeah. And, your own individual birth chart is going to say a lot about how your personal Saturn return will unfold.
Yeah.
Lori and I are both consulting astrologers, and so you can absolutely book a reading with us and we can unpack this further. But just some ways that you can also work with your own chart to figure this out is looking at what house in your chart Saturn is placed in and what houses Saturn rules in your chart. We've released a couple episodes about houses. So if that's a
Mm-hmm.
new technique for you, you can look at that. Like I have Saturn in the sixth house, and a big part of my Saturn return was knee surgery and an
Mm-hmm.
injury related to a sports accident because Saturn rules my fifth house. So even looking at the topics, if Saturn has to do with your 10th house, your Saturn return might have more to do with your career and public life. If it has to do with your eighth house, maybe you're, having a weird lawsuit because of a shared rental agreement with someone.
Mm-hmm.
It can, or jury duty if it's a more dignified Saturn like Lori and her Saturn in the eighth. Um,
Jury duty I never had to show up at.
but yeah, looking at the house topics that Saturn has to do with for you is a really good way to hone in on that. Also, working with the dignity of your Saturn, which Lori and I have released like 7 episodes on essential dignity,
Oh
I
yeah.
believe. So right now we're kind of in this transition time between Saturn and Pisces and Saturn and Aries, which have very different dignity. Saturn in Pisces is neutral. It is not a place that it rules or is exalted or fallen or anything. And it's ruled by Jupiter, who's a generally supportive planet. And Saturn in Pisces is just kind of like goofing off and swimming around in a whirlpool and, just like
Mm-hmm.
chilling out. And then Saturn in Aries is fallen. And so it's a very, very
Yeah.
loud, very strong Saturn that can have a lot of difficulties and limitations. And Lori and I actually released a whole episode about Saturn and Aries, and we have a whole episode about planets in
Yeah.
fall. So you can really dig into that.
Right.
But, for those of you who are in your Saturn return in Aries, it might be a particularly spicy Saturn return
Yeah.
because Saturn in Aries is particularly spicy and especially falls for the trap of, Aries is impatient and Saturn does best
Mm-hmm.
with patience. And it
Right.
can be kind of like wanting to put the gas and the brakes on at the same time. And so,
Right.
the Saturn and Aries people I know are workhorses who can accomplish so much. And there's actually a lot of gifts and power that come with having that fiery Mars ruled Saturn, but like you can also burn yourself out or do too much too quickly when you actually, if you like build a house and don't put down a proper foundation, then the house is always going to have structural issues. Um, so really looking at the dignity of your Saturn, the house placement, is Saturn conjunct any other planets or points? Like my Saturn is conjunct my moon, so that was further indication that I might be having body health issues, especially with it being in the sixth house. If Saturn's conjunct your Venus, maybe you're having some relationship difficulties, or you need to learn how to grow up and how you relate to others, or, so those can be ways you can work with your chart. And then one of the most important ones that Lori mentioned in passing is just paying attention to whether you were born during the daytime or the nighttime. And
Yeah.
we also have released a whole episode about sect, which is what this
Mm-hmm.
doctrine is. But I really have found that people born during the daytime tend to have easier Saturn returns than those of us born at nighttime because Saturn is of the day sect. The day kind of warms up Saturn, that's this colder planet. Saturn has to do with more external, public, visible daytime things. And so,
Yeah.
if you have a pretty neutral Saturn in a day chart, or even a strong, dignified Saturn in a day chart like Lori, your Saturn
Mm-hmm.
return might actually be like a very productive, fruitful time where, like, another thing that Lori, you've shared about your Saturn return was that was when you also shifted and stopped doing
Mm-hmm.
as much dangerous acrobatic stuff because you realized you
Mm-hmm.
were going to hurt yourself if you kept, flying in the air all the time because your
Right.
Saturn was able to see the consequences and then you were able to
Right.
bring in those limitations and that seriousness and just tell yourself to stop before you hurt
Yeah.
yourself.
I've
Um,
noticed so many themes of that, like people all of a sudden realizing that there's consequences to your actions
yeah,
during the Saturn return. And it's funny because I feel like if you have a dignified Saturn, um, then often you notice it before any consequences actually happen, and you're able to be like, oh, maybe I don't actually want to risk this anymore.
hmm,
But if you don't have a dignified Saturn, then you might push yourself too far, and
yeah.
it's, the consequences might actually show up.
Yeah,
Um,
because hard Saturn transits, whether it's the square, return, opposition, like the consequences will come. Like when you're in a
right.
Saturn time, anticipate, like maybe if you're someone who doesn't normally get parking tickets, you might get a parking ticket if it's your Saturn return. Like
Right.
it is a time where you can anticipate more
Yeah, like pay more
consequences.
attention.
And Saturn loves rules and regulations. And so actually maybe just like following the rules a little bit more. I feel like Saturn in Aries is it's we're also like breaking the rules and we need to be doing that as well.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah, day chart Saturns are a little nicer. If you're born at nighttime, really take your Saturn seriously because Saturn is a grumpy, cold old man to those of us born at
Yeah.
night. And then, we're not talking about Mars, but nighttime people do have more Mars gifts. We tend to not have
Hmm.
as many difficulties with Mars, and then daytime people do really need to watch out for Mars. So just to throw that in there as well.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Um, and I think about Saturn too a lot in the like with Rhea, especially as a,
Mm-hmm.
because I have the Rhea asteroid super prominent in my chart, and I know we did an episode on her, so definitely go listen to that if you're wanting more. But that's been something I've been thinking about a lot is Saturn is like the flow of time in a more structured way, and she has been showing up a lot as like the flow of time as like flow and wind and like
Mm-hmm.
just kind of going with the flow, going with time and like not trying to make any like major changes or anything. Whereas Saturn is going to be like that, the structure of it. So it's like two sides of the same coin almost.
Totally.
Can
Yeah, and
help you
Rhea
like
has
think
to
about it.
do, she's like pulling this chariot of like the
Right.
26,000 year cycle of time. Like she's on this
Right.
other scale with time. But when I was
Exactly.
earlier in my Saturn return, I was reading the Orphic hymn to Rhea a lot. And that was
Hmm.
very, very supportive as I went through my knee surgery. So yeah, reaching out to
Yeah.
Rhea, I mean, she knows Saturn ate all her babies,
Mhm.
so she definitely knows what he can do, and she resisted him. So,
Yeah.
Rhea can really help. And also familiarizing yourself with like the Chronos myths can be really helpful. Like the one that I just referenced, right, is that Kronos knew that his children were going to usurp him, and so every time Rhea would have one of their babies, he would eat it, like Dimitri
Right.
George described, like a oyster shooter.
Yep.
And so, he like eats Vesta and Demeter, or Hestia, sorry, Vesta's the Roman version, and Poseidon and Hades. And then finally, Rhea's sick of all her babies being eaten by her husband. And so when baby Zeus is born, Rhea wraps up a rock in a swaddle, and Saturn just like throws it back, and then Rhea ferries Zeus off to a mountain to be raised by a nanny goat in secret. And then once Zeus is able to grow to maturity, he comes back and overthrows his father, which is the Olympians overthrowing the Titans. And then all the Titans are thrown into Tartarus, into the depths of the underworld, and punished for that.
Yeah.
And then it's the time of the Olympians, and Zeus becomes the king of the gods. But, really like Saturn times could, like, what are you swallowing? What are you like holding on to? What are you not,
Right.
like, what changes are you not allowing to happen?
What do
Because
you need to let go
also,
of?
yes, what do you need to like purge and release?
Hmm.
But also, what do you need to swallow? Because sometimes you do actually just have to swallow stuff and suck it
Yeah.
up. But also, interestingly enough, I mean, the Greeks were obsessed with sons usurping their fathers, right? Because Kronos did that to Uranus and to his own father, right? Because when Kronos was born, Uranus and Gaia were the parents of the Titans, and Uranus wouldn't stop fucking Gaia and wouldn't give her space to birth their babies. And so she was like super pregnant and was super full of all of the Titans. And Gaia was like, please, someone help me, like, let my
Yeah.
children be born. And
Right.
Kronos, interestingly, was the one who came forward and with his scythe, which is the Saturn glyph is a scythe, and Kronos is very often portrayed holding a scythe and is associated with agriculture as well for this reason. But with
Hmm.
his scythe, he comes and cuts off Uranus's penis, and then the
Hmm.
foam from that, the ejaculation from that, goes and gets in the sea, and Aphrodite's born from his sea foam sperm. And then it's the time of the Titans, right? And so
True.
it is kind of interestingly like where are you overthrowing systems like Kronos did, and then where are you swallowing systems and not allowing change to happen? And really sitting with those myths can open up a lot in your subconscious and kind of help you bypass your thinky logical brain and come into your body a bit more of like what does it actually feel like to be in a Saturn time?
Right. Yeah, and like that's something too that's so important to remember is actually feeling it and actually slowing down. Because if you don't let it move through the body, then it gets stuck. And that's when
Hmm.
accidents, injuries, those things tend to manifest because the body's not releasing the things that it needs to release. And overthinking or just being up in your head, thinking is good, but overdoing it and getting stuck on those cyclical loops are just not going to bring about any change. And
Hmm.
so, like, remembering to feel it in your body is a really good reminder during any hard transit, honestly, really.
Yeah.
Um, just good words of advice for life. But in general, like Saturn is a particular time of that.
Yeah, and from an herbal perspective, Saturn is very cold and dry and
Mhm.
constricting, and Saturnian issues can be like arthritis or excessive dryness, or broken injuries,
Yeah.
stagnancy, excessive swelling, those sorts of things. And so, I had said earlier to like cultivate the virtues of Saturn, it can be good
Hmm.
to incorporate a quiet meditative practice and a very like austere one. Like Saturn isn't supposed to feel good. So like a serious austere meditative practice can be a good way to kind of learn the virtues of Saturn. But on the other end of it, making sure that you are also alleviating that Saturnian stagnant cold energy by getting enough movement and probably more gentle movement. Mars, I'd say maybe be a bit more vigorous with a Mars transit. But with Saturn, like even just making sure you're going on walks or doing stretching regularly, inviting a bit of warmth into your diet through like ginger or garlic or some pepper to actually like stimulate your circulation and get things moving. Um, Bringing more moisture in, marshmallow root. Linden is a really gentle moistening herb that's really, really yummy.
Hmm.
Um, Hibiscus as well. And then always when you're taking herbs internally, work with a doctor, make sure it's safe for you to do so. I'm just sharing these as kind of educational, fun information, not as medical advice. But yeah, inviting more warmth and movement in your life when things are feeling really stuck can be very, very helpful for Saturnian transits.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. All great.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess kind of the last takeaway I just want to make sure people have is that there's like so much fear and trepidation around Saturn transits. And as
Yeah.
someone who has had I'm not at the end of my Saturn return because I do have Saturn in Pisces, but the way Saturn has been in Pisces so far has been quite difficult for me, but it's also been quite generative. I mean, I do also have Jupiter and Sag squaring my Saturn in Pisces, which helps. But
Yeah.
Saturn returns can be really good invitations to grow up and to mature and to step into, Saturn works on a slower scale, so it's bringing you into new cycles and times of your life, right? You have these hard Saturn hits every 7 years, and you have your Saturn return every 28-ish years. And so it's really inviting you into this whole new time of your life, and especially your first Saturn return is looking at what you've inherited and what you had as a child that you didn't have much control over, and like what do you want to leave in the past and what do you want to bring forward with you as you work with time, as you work with Chronos. And a lot of like Saturn can bring rewards when you actually play by her rules and work with her. So don't be too scared of your Saturn return,
Yeah.
but do be prepared that it's not, we just released an
Yeah.
episode about Jupiter and Cancer, and like Jupiter and Cancer can feel really good and can bring a lot of pleasure and indulgence into our lives. And like Saturn doesn't necessarily, Saturn can feel good in like a satisfying, like, oh man, I put so much effort into this and now I can like
Yeah. And
really
here's my
see,
payoff.
Yeah, but it's not
Yeah.
Venus. It's not
Right,
Jupiter.
right, right.
But also don't be
Yeah.
too scared of your Saturn return either, because it can be a
Yeah.
really generative time.
I also I have two more things that I do want to
Mhm.
note. Um, for one, there's a couple really insane transits that happen to everybody right before the Saturn return, and I kind of feel
Mhm.
like sometimes those get conflated into the Saturn return energy itself, and that's going to be your reversed nodal return and your progressed lunar return.
Mhm.
And I guess we could actually just make separate episodes on both of those
We
things
could.
instead of going on full-blown rants here. But I feel like the other thing I was going to say, which actually might fit here better, is that your 20s are actually really hard. And I feel like that's a big lie that society tells you is that oh you're in your prime in your 20s and everything is going to be great and abundant and perfect and whatever, and it's like such a confusing time because it's the first time in your life where all of your friends are doing things differently and everybody's making their own decisions and you're not following a very critical path that you
Mhm.
used to be following with school or with whatever. Like there's always this very clear what's next until you're about 22, 23, and then all of a sudden you're just kind of thrown out into the world. And your 20s can be a very difficult, confusing time of trying to make big decisions, and your reverse nodal return can bring a lot of stress and pressure of, oh, am I doing things right? Am I in a job I like? Am I making good choices? And the progressed lunar return can kind of show up as just like wanting so badly to find alignment. And I think there's so many things to be said about both of those transits. And then after those end, you get launched into your Saturn return. And I think
Mhm.
that's the biggest thing is like you're already kind of having a lot of these big life crisis moments of like, who
Mhm.
am I? What do I want? What's going on? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, now the Saturn return is here to like make you find that structure. And so I think if you look at those three things as three separate things, that might be a healthier
Yeah.
or like more beneficial way of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the progressed lunar return can also, it comes and you're like, oh, wow, my body is
Hmm.
requiring more from me. Like I can't just like eat chips and
Yeah,
stay up all night like I could when I was 18.
right.
And you're kind of like learning how to take care of your body. And then you're launched into the Saturn return, which also encounters with Saturn will always make you feel older in some way. They'll make you aware of your age in some way, which can
Yeah.
be really, really scary, especially in an American cultural context where we
Yeah.
are horrified by aging and dying and all these things that are
Oh, yeah.
natural processes of life. But yeah, separating the Saturn return from the other, really big transits that everyone experiences in their mid to late 20s can be really
Yeah.
helpful. And also, your Saturn return kind of feels like a report card from the cosmos. And especially if you're not expecting it, and then someone comes in and starts just grading you really harshly, and you're like, oh, gosh, But
Yeah.
if you think of it in that way too, like you're about to kind of be judged for how things have gone so far. And especially in your 20s, like you haven't had much say or control over a lot of that. But
Right.
now you're kind of learning that you are at a point in your life where you have a lot more say and control. So what are you going to do with it? And Saturn brings clarity, which not always nice, doesn't always feel good, but is very helpful. Like you will leave a Saturn transit with more clarity about whatever Saturn signifies in your life. Um, and there's a lot of opportunity that can come from that as well.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, comment below. Let us know if you're in your Saturn return, if you're wrapping it up, if you've already completed it.
Mhm.
Maybe you're in your second Saturn return or coming up on your second Saturn return. Just let us know like how you've experienced Saturn in your life. We really love hearing from you guys. And yeah, thank you for tuning in. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any personal stories to share or thoughts and reflections about what we discussed in this episode, please comment down below or reach out to us on Instagram. And please come follow us on Instagram at ConversationsWPlanets, where we share forecasts and updates about the astrological movements happening in the sky, as well as updates about our episodes. The link to our Instagram is in the show notes down below.